Hi, I'm being joined today by Pitasanna from Canada. I'd like you to introduce yourself shortly. Who are you? What's the work that you've been doing, and your documentary group?
Thank you, first of all, for having me on your program. I'm very fortunate and blessed. My name is Pitasanna. I was born and raised in Canada. Grew up in Toronto, and I embarked on a six-part docu-series focusing on Canada's foreign policy. And I did this documentary series with a filmmaker friend of mine. His name is Ryan Ellis. And so I'd grown up studying the Canadian educational system throughout my high school, my university years, and I'd just been brainwashed into thinking how peaceful Canada was and how we only did good. And it wasn't really until that I was exposed to the truth that it inspired me to do this six-part docu-series.
And in terms of your docu-series as a whole, who would you say your target audience is?
Right. We made this docu-series in mind with people who were kind of like me in the beginning, who were like curious about Canada, like what we did in the world. Like, some people like they feel like Canada were just like a puppet of the United States. And to some extent that's true, but some people like they feel like Canada's doing something wrong in the world, but they just don't know what it is because our media isn't telling us the truth about what we're doing in the world, the atrocities we're committing. So this documentary series, we made it for Canadians who are curious about what their government is doing in different parts of the world. We wanted this documentary to attract Canadians who are genuinely curious, who want to know about what their government's doing, all the atrocities, and who want to do something about it. So the primary audience is Canadians, but we also want to, we make this docu-series public. You can watch it for free, and you can watch it anywhere around the world for free. So it's also to an international audience who have mistakenly believed that Canada is this peaceful nation, and we really have a good media PR system. So it's very effective in convincing, people across the world that we are this peaceful country when in reality we're not. And that's what our documentary series shows.
And I was particularly interested in episode 3, titled Canada's Support for Apartheid in South Africa and Israel. And that opens with your reflections on Canada being essentially a settler colonial state. And what I was really interested in watching that episode was also like someone who's based in the UK, and this organization, MPAC UK, is focused on Zionism, Israel, Palestine rights, and the UK, how the UK plays a role in that situation. And it's still a worthwhile watch for people like myself as well, because there's a quote from Noam, no, not a quote, there's an interview clip from Noam Chomsky, who points out that that part of the Anglosphere, but sorry, part of the strongest support for Israel comes from the Anglosphere. You've got Canada, obviously, but you've also got the US, also obviously, and you've also got Australia as well as Britain itself. So those of you who are in Britain, interested in British history as well, it definitely touches on that aspect as well. Um, and when watching the part on South Africa, it's really interesting to learn how Canada made a big show of being anti-apartheid whilst undermining international efforts to, apply BDS, boycott, divestment sanctions on apartheid South Africa. And I see parallels with how nations, particularly, I would say so-called Muslim-led nations, when they talk about Israel, but then they undermine efforts to criticize Israel. So you alluded to a truth, you alluded to a moment that really woke you up, shook you up out of that dream. What was that wake up moment for you?
So it's a long story, but I'll try to make it short. So I was waiting for a flight at the airport, and I was kind of scrolling through my phone, and I was on social media. I came across this article by this writer by the name of Yves Engler, and he is a Canadian journalist and critic of Canada's foreign policy, anti-militarist, peace activist. he had written an article about Canada's former Prime Minister, Lester B. Pearson. And in that article, he talked about how Lester B. Pearson supported the Vietnam War, how Canada assisted the US in the Vietnam War, and how Lester B. Pearson, he played an instrumental role in the expulsion, in the creation of the state of Israel and the expulsion of, which resulted in the expulsion of 700,000 Palestinians. Lester B. Pearson was portrayed in the public, in the mainstream, as being this peaceful prime minister. He brought peacekeeping into the international arena as a result of his brokering of the Suez crisis. He won a Nobel Peace Prize. So for me to read this article written by Yves Engler talking about how Lester B. Pearson was not actually a benevolent figure, but he was actually a hawkish figure. He was a strong supporter of the creation of Israel. He was a strong supporter, actually, of the Vietnam War. So that kind of just blew my mind open. And then it kind of led me down this rabbit hole where I found out Yves Engler had written a book on Canada's foreign policy. It was called the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, a collection of atrocities that Canada's committed, overthrowing democratically elected leaders, mining atrocities, just selling arms to human rights abusing nations, just a whole series of atrocities. So that led me down the rabbit hole. And then I came up with this idea to do a docuseries on Canada's foreign policy, and that's another story altogether.
Did you know that it was going to be a six-parter when you started, or was it like the rabbit hole deepened as you went in?
Yeah, no, I actually, we originally thought this was going to be like a 1 hour, 20-minute kind of thing, but obviously we were way off. It just seemed like I remember when, Ryan and I, we were talking about doing an outline for this docuseries, and then, I had an outline done, and then it just seemed like the more people we talked to, because in this docuseries, we speak to politicians, the Canadian politicians responsible for advocating and formulating Canada's foreign policy. So we go to the establishment and we get the establishment line, and then we interview the academics and dissidents who challenge that establishment line. So this is, one of the very few Canadian foreign policy documentaries that interviews the establishment and also the dissidents, the peace activists. So you get both sides of every issue. So we just found out every issue that we covered, there's just these layers and layers, and it became impossible really to kind of have it in like a 1 hour and 20-minute thing, and then to kind of do it justice, to do the audience justice, and kind of really explaining and fleshing out the intricacies, the nuances of Canada's foreign policy. So we just felt it had to be like this 6-part series. I mean, we could have done a 10-part or a 20-part, but we just had to cap it at some point.
And you guys did a very good job on it, because it definitely doesn't feel like you're being beat over the head with ideologically or politically or whatever. It really does feel like it almost feels conversational. Not literally two people, but two different points of views, and both point of views are presented in a bit of a tit for tat kind of way, in a sort of like a one side and then here's the other side, and it works out, as a viewer, it works out fantastically balanced. And my personal favorite part is when you interview Canada's former ambassador to Israel, and he tried to defend Canada's pro-Israel UN resolution votes by saying that they're not legally binding, so Canada isn't contradicting its support of human rights. And, one of the other things he also explained is that Canadian policy stays the same despite the government in power. And when he said that, he didn't use those exact words, I'm paraphrasing, but when he said that, I thought, oh, did you say the quiet bit out loud? Like, it doesn't matter which government is power. If it's the alleged Dove Party, the alleged Warhawk Party, their policy on apartheid Israel stays the same. The only thing that changed is the tone and if they criticize. So if Canadian policy prioritizes Israeli security, isn't that just a way to justify selling weapons to an apartheid state? This country, as reprehensible as it is, their security is really important. We got to sell them these guns. We got to sell them these attack helicopters and these drone components that they're using to destroy a civilian population. or am I being too one-sided? What do you think?
No, I think you hit the nail right on the head. I think the core of Canada's support for Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories, the core reason lies in Canada's own history, which we touch on in that episode, which is that Canada itself is a settler colonial nation founded on the brutal expulsion, the genocide of its indigenous people. So that's why Canada supports Israel, which was founded on the brutal expulsion, the subjugation of its indigenous people, the Palestinian Arabs. So right there, there's a settler colonial bond which is unbreakable. And that's why Canada continues to support Israel. That's why Canada supported apartheid South Africa. Apartheid South Africa was the same thing. It was these white settler colonial individuals who had subjugated the indigenous black population. So that is the core reason why Canada supports Israel. It's because it sees itself in Israel. It sees Israel as this settler colonial, quote unquote, democracy, which we must protect at all costs. And no, regardless of whatever government is in power, they're going to maintain that status quo because they don't see any significant grassroots agitation that's going to compel them to change course. That's going to compel them to abandon their support for settler colonial Israel.
Because to criticize a fellow colonial state is to criticize themselves and to criticize the structures that have put those all these parties into power in the first place. That's a really profound way of looking at it. And I mean, I wouldn't want to say depressing because we all got to fight the good fight. We all got to speak truth to power. And something else I found interesting that I learned through your documentary, I've never seen this anywhere else, is that it was a Canadian Zionist. At least one of the academics called him a Zionist. It was a Canadian Zionist who played a large part in creating the UN partition plan that ended up giving 55% of the land, I believe, to the incoming Jewish population, which was less than a third of the population. And according to the academics who spoke in your documentary, this key Canadian, he wanted to balance the desire to create a state for the persecuted Jews. He also wants to balance that with the expectations of the British and the Americans and even the Soviets. So, it's like from the beginning, this Canadian individual, Canada's policy, it's always taking its cues, its lead from other, superpowers or influences around the world. Does that mean that, in this modern day and age, in our contemporary times, is Canada still trapped in its foreign policy on Israel by the whim of its powerful American neighbor? Or is there a chance of a breakaway difference in policy? What are your thoughts?
I think if Canada wanted to, Canada could vote in favor of UN resolutions that are criticizing Israel's settlement building, that are criticizing Israel's expulsion of Palestinians, that are criticizing Israel's abuses in carrying out its occupation. Canada could vote in favor of those resolutions, and Canada would not really face consequences from the United States. I mean, if you really look at the whole picture, Canada's Jewish population, it's less than 2% in Canada. We have a really, really small Jewish population. And although Canada does have an Israel Jewish lobby, its influence on Canadian politics is very questionable. It's not like APAC in the United States where you have politicians that are rushing to give speeches and that are occurring, favor the current votes. We do have politicians that like to, have this pro-Israel agenda, but the impact that actually has in translating to votes is very questionable because an overwhelming majority of Jews in Canada are actually liberal, left-leaning. So, and it's very questionable to what extent that actually translates to whether or not the politician supports Israel or its occupation. So if Canada wanted to, it could take a very principled stance and say, we're going to stop selling arms to Israel, which Canada continually does. It does annually. It can't, Canada could say we're going to ban products that are made by Israel in settlements. We're going to ban their entry into Canada. And we're going to vote in favor of UN resolutions, and potentially we're going to impose sanctions. And Canada could take this position, and it will not fall out of favor of the United States. Uh, uh, so Canada, if it wanted to, could take a principled position, and it would not really pay a huge political cost. Certainly not domestically. From the U.S. might be like, we're a little concerned about this, but the trade relationship will still continue because it's a multi-billion-dollar trade relationship. The United States is not going to cut off its trade because Canada started to decide to vote in favor of UN resolutions. Canada actually, for a time, was voting in favor of UN resolutions that were critical of Israel's settlement activity in the 80s and in the 70s a little bit. And then towards a little bit in the 90s, and then when Stephen Harper came into office, then it just went off the rails because he was such a hard right-wing Zionist figure that Trudeau then had to continue that position where Canada voted against UN resolutions, and it's kind of just been continuing on from there. But if Canada wanted to, it could continue its historical path where it initially voted in favor of UN resolutions criticizing Israel's settlement activity. It could vote in favor of all of them, and it will not face censure from the United States, and it will not affect domestically Canadian politicians' chances of getting reelected. The reason why Canada supports Israel is because there's a lot of money to be made in selling arms to Israel. There's a settler colonial tie that I mentioned, and Canada sees itself as a reflection of Israel, of Israel's so-called secular liberal democracy in a geographic region that's filled by these thuggish Islamist extremist dictatorships. So that's basically the reason.
As you said, there is a historical record of Canada voting on resolutions that criticize Israel, but like the point that you really make clear in episode 3 is that in a way, Canada's stance and behavior with Israel is a continuation of its behavior with South Africa, and you highlight this really, really clearly in your documentary that when it comes to making money, when it comes to making a decision, then making money is the primary priority. They were selling arms to apartheid South Africa, even though their words were critical about apartheid in South Africa. And then when it came to the downfall of apartheid in South Africa, Canada touted itself, blew its own horn in terms of like how great were we when we were criticizing apartheid South Africa, when most of the world was by that point. Certainly most of Africa was criticizing the apartheid regime. So it seems that Canada might be one of the last countries, along as it was with South Africa, to really actually put its money where its mouth is and stop making money out of apartheid Israel. So it's not just about sending money to Israel. Canadian aid to Palestine is also, like you highlighted this really clearly. It's aid to Palestine is largely spent on Palestinian security forces, which on the face of it, okay, sounds fair enough, sounds very, very beneficial. But what these security forces mainly do is in the West Bank, they suppress protesters. They protect the organs of the Palestinian state as far as it is, which again sounds benevolent enough. But these same organs of the Palestinian state are really just enabling Israel's suppression of resistance in the occupied territories, particularly the West Bank. So is this aid really helping Palestine? Is this aid aiding Palestine? And do most Canadians know what their taxes are being spent on?
That's a very good point. I'm glad you brought it up. The politicians, Canadian politicians. I remember, Stephen Harper, he was like, we're providing aid to the Palestinians. And then, a lot of these, prime ministers, they'll tout that we're being two-sided here. We're providing aid to the Palestinians. We're providing aid to Israel. But if you look at what that aid is going to, as you mentioned, it's actually going, the Palestinian aid, the aid that Canada's providing to the Palestinians, it's actually going towards their security forces. So anytime that there is some civil unrest in Gaza, and the Palestinians in the West Bank are in uproar as to why the Palestinian government, the Palestinian National Authority, why they're not in solidarity with their brothers and sisters in Gaza, and they then start to protest the Palestinian security forces with Canadian aid, with Canadian training, they then suppress the Palestinians in the West Bank who are voicing dissent or voicing opposition. So a lot of Canadians actually don't know that this is what their aid is going towards. There's another segment in our documentary series where we talk about Canada's pension plan. And Canada's pension plan, how it works is, if you're employed, if you're a Canadian, you're paying into your pension plan. And the Canadian government, they invest your pension money into some of the most militaristic, polluting, rapacious companies like Lockheed Martin, like Raytheon, oil companies, just tobacco companies, some of the most horrendous companies you can think of. And they're investing your money into that so they can get more returns. And a lot of Canadians don't know that, just like a lot of Canadians don't know that our taxes is going towards suppressing legitimate dissent among the Palestinians in the West Bank against Israel's occupation and against the Palestinian Authority's support for Israel's occupation and their cooperation and collusion in prolonging the occupation.
Yeah, I mean, it's stomach churning, and thanks for going further clarifying. And it just, I find that as a reminder to myself, like as an organization, as an individual, why do we oppose Zionism? It's because, as Malcolm X said, injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, to paraphrase Malcolm X. And, there is no such thing as being a disinterested party when it comes to oppression, injustice, and the exploitation, the global exploitation of oppressed individuals. Someone out there is not just making money from it, but is furthering their interests in making money from it. So just to bring the discussion to a close, and just want to pick your brain a bit more. Do you think Canada's policy on Israel needs to change, and how could it change? Because, as that ambassador mentioned, it doesn't matter what color the government is, doesn't matter if it's this wing or that wing. They've always been consistent in supporting Israel's security, which basically is a justification for selling weapons to an apartheid state. Does that need to change? How could that change happen? What are your thoughts?
I think it certainly needs to change. I'll tell a story. In Canada, we have a political party called the New Democratic Party, and they're the third largest party in Canada in terms of the number of seats they have in Parliament. And the New Democratic Party is like a center left party, quote unquote, the Bernie Sanders version in Canada. And their leader, his name is Jagmeet Singh, and he's a Sikh. He's a Sikh Canadian. He wears a turban. And when he came into his position as leader of the New Democratic Party, the NDP party, he was very pro-Israel. He was extremely pro-Israel, actually. When he would be asked, people would have to bombard him. Activists would have to bombard him at like coffee shops to try to get him to voice something critical of Israel. And anytime they try to get him to voice something critical of Israel, he would kind of just say, Israel is a democracy, our ally, blah blah blah. And there were numerous activists when the NDP, the party would have a convention, an annual convention where you would vote on certain party policies. And for years and years and years, activists would try to get a resolution which would call for Canada to sanction Israel for its atrocities, for its occupation of the Palestinian territories. And almost year after year, for some reason or another, the resolution would not get voted on. It would kind of be thrown off. And then finally, after uh, the Israeli atrocities, the expulsion in Sheikh Jarrah, finally it kind of hit a fever pitch where Jagmeet Singh could no longer ignore the activists, the NDP activists, and he finally, in the House of Commons, we actually show this in the episode, Jagmeet Singh in the House of Commons tells Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, we need to think about banning arms sales to Israel, as a start. But what he's really hinting at is we need to really sanction Israel for its occupation. And that was really the first time where a leader of a major political party in Parliament, said to the sitting prime minister, you need to ban arms sales to Israel. What Israel is carrying out in Sheikh Jarrah is atrocious. Its occupation is atrocious. And the reason why that happened is because of just decades and decades and years of grassroots agitation by the NDP, the peace activists, that finally this leader who was so pro-Israel when he came into office has now shifted completely, and he's now voices continuous positions that are critical of Israel's settlement activity, of Israel's occupation. So to answer your question of what needs to happen for the Canadian government to change its very pro-Israel position, what needs to happen is that there needs to be continuous grassroots agitation where the politicians can no longer ignore their citizens, their outcry as to how their government can support Israel's occupation, despite the fact that Gaza is on the brink of becoming uninhabitable. The fact that Palestinians are continually being expelled from their homes are being bulldozed down. How can we continue to support this? How can we continue to sell arms? How can we continue to provide aid? How can we continue to vote in favor of UN resolutions when there is that fever pitch grassroots agitation where the Canadian politicians can no longer ignore their domestic, the grassroots from their domestic population? That's when we'll see a shift in Canada's foreign policy, and Canada will most likely start by suspending its arms to Israel, and then first voting in favor of UN resolutions, suspending its arms to Israel, and then maybe even imposing sanctions on Israel's settlements and products coming from Israel's settlements, and then maybe ultimately even sanctions on Israel, the state itself. So I think, but it's such a long way, it's, now there's even, we talk about in our docuseries this discussion of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and we ask the foreign affairs critic of the NDP what her position is on BDS, and she says, "Oh, we don't support BDS," even though their leader is now effectively more or less calling for BDS when he's saying a part of it, at least when he's saying that Canada should stop selling arms to Israel. So, although that word can't be used, certain tactics of BDS, I think the NDP are in favor of, and I think we can, with the right mobilization, get the Canadian government to ultimately support, maybe not BDS as in those words. I mean, there are certain elements of BDS that I don't support even, because I just don't think tactically it's the right move. But I just think it depends on the right tactics. It depends on the grassroots mobilization, the pressure. And once that pressure has reached a fever pitch, like it did in the case of Canada's support for South Africa, then we will see a change.
Well, thanks for such a comprehensive clarification. Tenacious consistency seems to be the key thing here, just keeping up the pressure and keeping it going and going. So as I've said before, an excellently crafted documentary, and so much work put into it. I want to see it spread through the Canadian viewership, and hopefully through the UK as well. Where can people find this documentary, the work around it, yourself? Where are you on social media, and how can people find out more about the documentary and so on?
So you can watch the documentary, as I mentioned, for free. It's on our website, truthtothepowerless.com. That's truthtothepowerless.com. And all 6 episodes, if you scroll down on the homepage, if you scroll down, you'll see all 6 episodes there. You can watch them all for free. There's no charge at all. We kindly ask for donations to help us keep the site running, because it is costly to host the content. And my social media plugins are all on the top right corner of the homepage of the website. You'll see my Twitter, and that's where I'm sharing a lot of content related to a lot of the stuff that I discuss in this docuseries. So you can find me there. You can find the docuseries there.
Thank you so much for your time, Pita, and thank you so much for all the work you've put into this with your team.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.